Now we're going to have a session of questions and answers. I know we're a bit tight for time, but normally I try and let everybody have their say, because depending on the ambassador, he'll try and answer it again as best he can, anything, questions you have for him. So if you would start with the gentleman in the second row, please.
My name is Alan Rayner, and I write poetry, and we thank you for a wonderful talk, a very inspiring talk. I couldn't agree with you more that one of the poet's tasks is to make people aware of the importance of the history of their tradition and their country, and that their country should be free. I'm very pleased that you brought that out so marvelously. My question is for my own poetry. I believe that all the countries have an innate wisdom from the past, and that it's inspired either from heaven or from other religious outlooks. Could you perhaps give me some enlightenment on that?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm others here could offer spiritual guidance. Although I did this year, I did fulfill a great ambition on St. Patrick's Day in a church in Kensington, I think it was. I actually read a Yeats poem from the pulpit, and I thought that was a great achievement to get up into the pulpit. And quite a one of these old-fashioned ones, quite high up, not like not the democratic kind of churches. This is a kind of a more aristocratic church with a sort of a very imposing pulpit that I felt like sort of delivering a hellfire and damnation speech. But I read the Wild Swans and Cool instead. But anyway, Yeats was I think was a genuinely religious man. Remember, he came from a line of clergymen, Church of Ireland clergymen. His great grandfather and his grandfather were both clergymen, one a bishop and one a curate in Drumcliff, where Yeats is buried. That's why he decided to have himself buried in Drumcliff, because of his ancestral connection with the parish of Drumcliff. His father was destined to enter the church as well. His father became a skeptic in religion and completely turned against all things religious. And if you like, W.B. Yeats was also heavily influenced by his father. He was also rebelling against his father. He completely rejected his father's kind of materialism and his father's typical late 19th century practical attitude towards religion. Yeats, of course, grew up at a time when there were all these New Age religions around, Theosophy, the Order of the Golden Dawn, and he was, for all of his life, he was really interested in mystical religions and secret, religious, societies, the Order of the Golden Dawn, and so forth. And so he was fundamentally a deeply religious man, but not in the conventional sense. But certainly, just take this verse from Under Ben Bulben. And now, by the way, when I mention race here, it doesn't mean race in a kind of in our sense, because in those days there were conventions of the Irish race. The Irish were regarded as a separate race, and indeed every nationality was regarded. Races really means nationality in this case, but many times man lives and dies between his two eternities, that of race and that of soul. And ancient Ireland knew it all. Whether a man dies in his bed or the rifle knocks him dead, a brief parting from those dear is the worst man has to fear. Though grave diggers' toil is long, sharp their spades, their muscles strong, they but thrust their buried men back in the human mind again. So he had this idea of kind of an immortal sort of presence, if you like. So he was a deeply religious man, but deeply unconventional, and couldn't have belonged to any church. And indeed, in his later years, he became more and more attached to the Anglo-Irish tradition of his childhood, which he enthusiastically rejected as a young man, and then gradually rediscovered, and in that sort of famous, infamous speech he gave in Shannon in the Senate in 1926, opposing the proposal to ban divorce. He said, "We are no petty people. We are the people of Burke, the people of Grattan, the people of Parnell. We have contributed all the intelligence and intellect to this country, and if you defeat us now, your victory will be short, and we will eventually triumph, and our triumph will be permanent." You can imagine this didn't endear him very much to the majority of people in Ireland, and indeed even people of his own tradition were a bit embarrassed by this kind of strident. Essentially, I think in his later years he became an aristocratic nationalist. Someone asked me about fascism. I mean, obviously, in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of people, a lot of decent, intelligent people were kind of taken in by some of these right-wing philosophies. We now know that they're destructive because we have the experience of the Second World War to tell us what these philosophies were ultimately all about. But in the 20s and 30s, that wasn't so apparent. And yes, I suppose he felt a need for order and discipline in society. He had some sort of views that we would now consider to be a bit dodgy about eugenics and so on. But ultimately, I've read Roy Foster's biography of Yeats, and Roy Foster comes to the conclusion that Yeats, whatever he was guilty of, foolishness and gullibility perhaps, but not of any sort of serious, brush with fascism. So I don't think that charge it's there, and certainly Colin Bruce O'Brien was strong in the view that Yeats had strong fascist tendencies. But I think, looking at it, he, in one of his poems, death poems, he wrote, I hope, even if I die old, I shall die a foolish, passionate man. And I think he managed those two things. Certainly passionate at the end of his life, and a bit foolish as well. No harm in a bit of folly here and there. It helps to bring people down off the pedestal.
How much did he hang around with the Golden Dawn?
Well, in his early years, certainly he was, as I said, that period in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, there was a whole raft of these New Age religions. And one was Theosophy. This was a woman called Madame Blavatsky, who was a bit of a fraud, I think, probably. But she certainly had an ability to. And there were all sorts of Indian preachers that were hanging around London at that time. So it was very easy to fall in. But Yeats himself really, I think, for all of his life, really, was interested in spiritualism and seances and all of that. And then, of course, the most amazing thing he did really was, eventually in 1917, he proposed to Maud Gonne for the final time, and she rejected him again. He then proposed to her daughter. She married Francis Stewart, ended up in Germany during the Second World War. And then he eventually married Georgie Hyde-Leese, who was a well-to-do, well-educated woman with an interest in spiritualism as well. So they had that in common, this interest in mysticism and Indian philosophy and New Age religions. And initially he thought that he made a terrible mistake, and he wrote these, within days of his marriage, wrote these letters to Lady Gregory bemoaning the mistake he'd made. It was a terrible thing, he'd done the wrong thing, and he'd done a terrible thing to marry this woman that he didn't really care for. He discovered. Then amazingly, he started to engage in what was called automatic writing. That she would sit down, and the spirit world, some spirits would dictate their wisdom through Yeats' wife, and that, of course, made him as happy as anything. Happy as marriage, and then on in. Never, and in fact, I think they had a good marriage after that. No, he still had his other interests, and when he died, there were always women in the area who had connections with Yeats. But certainly, in the sense that he had a happy marriage after that, because his wife had this extraordinary capacity to, and he had thousands of sessions, just the two of them in a room together, and she communicating these, this wisdom from the spirit world, and he would ask questions, and the answers would come back, and then he ended up writing this book called A Vision, which is still it's quite difficult to read. I'm I mean, it's a bit like filling his wig. It's good to know. It's good to know of its existence, but you don't have to spend too much time reading it. But all you have to know really is that it's all about that history goes in 2,000-year cycles, and this is what inspired the Second Coming. This rough beast that slouches towards Bethlehem to be born because he believed that we were coming to the end of the Christian 2,000-year period, and then there would be a new society would start up and so on. So, in other words, he was a man very interested in these things, and this interest continued throughout his life, and he wouldn't have been a very good parishioner, but he had, I think, a genuine interest in the things of the Spirit.
So what you're saying is there's no food.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. What I want to know is a terrible beauty is born in those lines. What did Yeats envisage when he wrote those lines? Was he looking to the future of Ireland and also what did they want to do?
Well, of course, he wrote those lines in the summer of 1916, so the ink was hardly dry on the proclamation when he was writing those lines. So he couldn't have been doing anything other than thinking about the event. And in letters to Lady Gregory, which are quite revealing, he used that phrase, not quite a terrible beauty is born, but I have this idea of a terrible beauty. So he was worried about what he saw as, because remember, this was happening during the First World War. People were being slaughtered in their tens of thousands on the battlefields of the Western Front. So, and then of course you had, so there was a great, I think he saw a great kind of, in a way it kind of sort of confirmed his own kind of apocalyptic sort of fears and expectations. But I genuinely think that he was ambivalent about the rising. He didn't condemn it, but he didn't also praise it. He was in between. And it's that ambivalence that gives the poem its great, I mean, no political poem that's just, if you think about some of the poems that were written in the 1930s that are very, left-wing or right-wing, they're terrible poems because they're based on a kind of a political philosophy that once the time passes, they're no longer of any relevance. But his poem is great because it's a meditation on revolution and its consequences. And therefore, A Terrible Beauty is, I think, a statement of ambivalence. He understands that it was a violent thing that could cause serious problems in the future because it could unleash a cycle of violence, which he feared, and which actually happened, of course. But then it has that noble quality as well, so that even someone like John McBride, that drunken, vainglorious lout, could become heroic through his sacrifice. So he understood, I think, the sacrifice that had been made. He admired it. In a way, I think, Romantic Ireland died for Yeats in 1913. It was reborn in 1916, and then probably died again in the 1920s. And it's that kind of, Yeats had a lifelong argument with Ireland. He was never your conventional Irish patriot. I think he was a good Irishman, he was a patriotic Irishman, but not a conventional one. And frequently throughout his life, he would rage against Ireland. But think about his last poem, Under Ben Mulligan, and the final lines. He says, "Sing the peasantry, and then hard-riding country gentlemen, the holiness of monks, and after porter drinkers' randy laughter. Sing the lords and ladies gay, that were beaten into the clay through 7 heroic centuries. Cast your mind on other days, that we, in coming days, may be still the indomitable Irishry." In other words, even in his last weeks, he was writing about asking people to cast your mind on other days. Think about our past, so that we, in the coming days, may be still the indomitable Irishry. We may be this people with our own indomitable spirit. So, I think he was a good Irishman, but not a conventional one. A good patriot, but not a conventional one. And A Terrible Beauty is an expression of ambivalence, essentially.
Was he kind of an observer otherwise? Never really after it, never really got cut.
into it. An outsider's looking in.
Yeah, well, actually, I gave a talk there recently at the Mall Galleries on W. B. Yeats and Jack B. Yeats. And I made the point that, to some extent, Yeats was always a visitor to Ireland. Because remember, he lived from, it's been part of his childhood, went to school in London, lived in London. Now, spent long summers back in Sligo and that's where he really got to know Ireland. But at the end of the summer or after a certain number of months, he transferred back to London again. And he and his sisters pined away for Ireland, and for Sligo in particular. But remember, from the late 1880s until about 1921, he lived basically in London. He was London Irish. He was a London Irishman. And I think, therefore, to some extent, he was always a bit of a visitor, a bit of a slight outsider, passionately committed to Ireland. For example, he was offered a knighthood, and he wouldn't accept it because I want to be, he said, I'm an Irish poet, and I'm nothing other than an Irish poet. So he continued to have this affection for and interest in Ireland, even though he was frequently frustrated by things that he encountered in Ireland.
I think we have time for one last question. Seamus, please.
At what stage did he become interested in the Japanese loan?
Well, I think it was probably in the 1920s when he was visiting America. Was it in, I can't remember the year now, it was either just before the First World War, probably was actually, and he was in San Francisco, and this Japanese diplomat gave him a sword, an old samurai sword that had been in this man's family for hundreds of years. Yeats was fascinated by this idea of owning, being given a piece of metal that had existed for so many centuries. And I think that got him interested in Japanese law plays, and of course, it wouldn't be my kind of my main interest in Yeats is in his Irishness, his Irish background. In fact, if I was writing a book on Yeats, it would be W.B. Yeats and Ireland, or W.B. Yeats and Irish history, something like that would be my topic. But certainly, he was interested in Japan. Now, he did, in this essay that I mentioned about the 7 great fountains in the garden of the world's imagination, one of the other fountains was Japan. So he wasn't interested in Japan from the early period, but I think it was particularly brought into focus probably by Ezra Pound as well. Because remember, Ezra Pound was a great lover of all things Japanese as well, and he would have been, he would have, from Pound, he would have become aware of the haiku, the Japanese haiku. He never wrote one as far as I know, but certainly would have been interested in that. But I think the no plays comes from this kind of being given this sword and suddenly discovering that he had part of. And he was invited at one stage to take up a lecturing post in Japan. He never did it, but would have probably solved his money problems, but it mightn't have been very good for his writing.
Thank you.
Just one quick one.
One quick one. If you come all the way from Wexford to ask this one, yeah.
that he was such that he
Out on the Ballard, something like that.
No. St. Marcus, the south part of the county. That he was such a good. That he proposed. I've never heard anybody propose 6 or 7 times, so that fascinates me. But they do say that she was such good man with words. I hope he used different words 6 or 7 times he proposed. Or was that the problem? He used the same words.
Well, I think she sort of said that she regarded them as having spiritual marriage, but not a marriage in the normal sense of the word. I think he wanted more of a marriage in the normal sense of the word. Look. It's certainly true that Maud Gonne was kind of muse for him. I mean, all the early poems, like When You Were Old, written about Maud Gonne, and the middle poem, like No Set in Troy, likewise about Maud Gonne. And even towards the end of his life, he developed this kind of personal mythology. So he had this in a poem called The Municipal Gallery Revisited. He walks through the gallery of Dublin and he sees Synge and John O'Leary and Lily Gregory and his father and all these people. And he says, how does it go? know where man's glory begins and ends. My glory was I had such friends. And Maud Gonne was one of those figures that he created a kind of a personal pantheon, a personal sort of list of sort of stellar figures that for him were vitally important, and Maud Gonne was certainly probably number one in that. The very fact that among school children, he'd been married for 10 years after all he wrote that poem, and still she stands before him like a living child, you know. So he was fascinated by her really to the end of his life, and in his later poems she keeps popping up again. So she became a kind of a symbol of something that he couldn't quite ever fully grasp, but was very important to him. And I'm not sure what language he used, but I'm sure as a poet he had very many linguistic resources. I have to say myself that when I first met my wife, Rita, in India, I read her Yeats' poems on our first date, I think. Not every young woman would be impressed with that. But Rita took it in her stride, and I read Yeats' poems to her at our wedding. At our wedding ceremony, I read Had I the Heavens in Bridal Cloths. I didn't read When You Were Old. It's not a great book. Anyway, thank you very much.
Right, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. This too close to me, so probably I'm shouting at everybody. The actual power and the explanation that you've given us has absolutely been fantastic. And as a final thank you, I would like to call Tom Chinnery, our local artist, to present you with a little momentum of the Luton Irish Forum and W.B. Yeats, and hopefully you will come and see us again, and come next year perhaps and do something for us when we get ourselves organised, because I think the turnout tonight, the efforts that's gone into this has been fantastic. Tom?
Thank you very much.
Once again, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Hope you all enjoyed it. I'm sure you did. And a big hand for the ambassador of going out and talk to us. So thanks very much for that. Thank you.